can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone who's joining. Thank you so much for joining us on your Tuesday evening. My name is Rebecca. I'm the events director for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, and we're super excited to be holding this event series on K-12 STEM education. Before I get started, I'm going to give a brief introduction to what ESAL is and talk about our partner for this event as well. So Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, or ESAL, is an all-volunteer organization that's really dedicated to empowering people with STEM backgrounds to engage with their local governments and communities. It was launched by engineers and scientists who have background in public policy and who realized that although there's a lot of organizations that focus on federal science policy, there's not a lot in this sort of local space. We are also a 501c3 nonprofit status organization. So what do we actually do within ESAL? We provide a number of different resources and information. We have a great blog series where we highlight different people and organizations that are working at the intersection of STEM and local government or local community engagement. We have a great resources page where we have step-by-step instructions on how to do things like advocate with your state legislature or join a local board or commission, as well as a volunteer, a database of places where you can volunteer and get involved. And then we also hold events just like this. So webinars and workshops and trying to highlight some really cool work that people are doing in this space, such as the folks that you will meet today who are focused around STEM education. We would love for, if you're attending and you're interested, to for you to get more involved with ESAL. We'd love for people to get in touch via email or social media, hear your thoughts and feedback. You could write a blog post with us if you think that maybe you or your organization could be featured. We do have some open volunteer positions right now, both with the virtual events team, which is a super fun opportunity in my unbiased opinion, as well as our web team. And we have it's not listed, but we also have a database management project that's really exciting. If that is something that is your jam, get in touch with us. And we also have a workshop that if you are with a school or an organization, that you can request. And finally, before we turn it over to our panelists and our moderator for today, I just want to say that we're very grateful to be partnering with the SciTech Institute for this event. And we have on the call Claire Conway from the Institute, who's going to give a little brief overview of what the Institute does.
Hello, I'm Claire from SciTech Institute, and thank you, Rebecca, for the quick introduction. So I'll just share a little bit about SciTech and what we do. We have a couple of big programs, but what I really like to showcase first is our STEM ecosystem, which is a grassroots network of folks all over the state of Arizona working in all different areas, from education and business and nonprofit, community organizations, government, students, all working together around STEM and STEM education. And we're a part of the National STEM Ecosystems Initiative. Our goal is to create meaningful cross-sector collaborations around STEM, share resources and align efforts in education and the workforce. We've also got the Chief Science Officer Program, or CSO, in which 6th to 12th grade students are elected or selected to be STEM ambassadors in their schools. This program is actually international, so it's not just in Arizona. We're always looking for new locations to start up the CSO program. We're all over the US and a couple of other different countries as well. Over the course of the year, our students will design and implement an action plan, things like hosting career panels, starting STEM clubs at their school, morning announcements, cleaning up parks, and overall they just work to increase awareness and excitement around STEM among their peers. And lastly, we also host the Arizona SciTech Festival, which is a huge celebration of STEM that happens over 2 months in February and March every year all over the state. Through the festival, we have thousands of events, tours and workshops, panels, all sorts of different things, and it's a great way to connect with STEM and the community all around the state. So I know we have people from all over the place, not just Arizona, on this call, but if you would like to learn more about our ecosystem or our Chief Science Officers or any of our other programs, I would love to connect with you. So I'll share my email and our website in the chat, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Claire. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dipali, who will be moderating this event. So I feel very honored to introduce Dipali, who's my friend and colleague. Dr. Dipali Raval is an educator and scientist. She currently serves as the Director of Education for the Harvard Graduate Program in Bacteriology and Infectious Diseases Consortium, where she leads the development of innovative, inclusive curriculum for biology and public health graduate students. Dipali is also committed to supporting access to science careers for youth from communities that face health injustices. And she's worked closely with local programs like the Harvard Health Professions Recruitment and Exposure Program, as well as national initiatives like the CDC Science Ambassador Fellows Program. So Dipali, so glad to have you here, and let you take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm excited to be here. Welcome, everyone. So just to give everybody an idea of our plan for the evening, we'll start with intros from each of our panelists, and then start with a more general conversation about how curriculum can shape equity and justice in K-12 STEM education. And then we'll shift over the course of the evening to also focusing on how we can do things in different STEM spaces like labs and internships and other things to support inclusivity in STEM. And then we'll also talk about the types of things that practicing scientists and engineers can do to support this mission through outreach or advocacy or other things in our own communities. So we will take questions towards the end, but you're welcome to put them into the Q&A as we go, or you can ask them at the end and we'll keep an eye on them. So we're going to start with, I'll just mention our panelists and then they'll actually each give an intro. So first we have Dr. Rasheda Likely, who's an assistant professor of science education at Kennesaw State University. Then Dr. Danielle Morales-Doyle, who is an assistant professor of science education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And then Sam Long, who's a high school science teacher in the Denver Public Schools. So Rasheda, I'll have you start with your intro of what brought you into science and science education, and then anything else you want to share about yourself that is relevant to our conversation today.
Sure. Thank you. And hello, everyone. So glad to be here. Again, I'm Rasheda Likely. And what brought me into science was I was always a curious kid, always tinkering with something, usually breaking it, trying to reconfigure and make a new way to make it work. Most of the time it didn't work, but that's also a learning process. And growing up, my grandparents were sickly as they got older, and I would be the one to go along with them to doctor's appointments. And so the more the doctors talked to them, the more I started asking questions and ended up on a path toward a medical degree, which also got sidetracked into a master's program that led me into science education from an after-school program. So I'm a mixed bag of all the things. I have a background in biology, but also a PhD in science education. So just bringing some different perspectives in that way. Again, I am a teacher educator, currently teaching science methods and trends and issues in science education. And I'm living in the Atlanta area with research interests around curriculum development, culturally sustaining frameworks, and implementing those also in assessment. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Rasheda. Daniel.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Rasheda said about just being glad to be here. Thank you all for organizing this event. I really like the topic and the organization. I'm glad you all exist. So when I think about what got me into science education, I think of a few key experiences. One that I'll talk about happened when I was a high school chemistry student. So I grew up in a neighborhood where there were 2 medical waste incinerators right down the block. And my dad was a community organizer. And so he had been working with some of our neighbors to get these facilities shut down. You know, we wondered stuff like, was my brother's asthma to blame, you know, related to growing up right next to these medical waste incinerators. And so my dad brought me these readings about polychlorinated dibenzene dioxins and other contaminants like mercury that were emitted from the incinerators. And I was a 10th grader, so he was encouraging me to apply what I was learning in school to what they were doing in the neighborhood. I don't think my dad ever took high school chemistry, and it wasn't exactly what we were learning in high school chemistry class. but that was the first time I connected learning science with my family's political and community engagement. And so I went on to study chemistry in college, and some of my mentors who were teachers, not chemistry teachers, but teachers of other subjects, taught me about the work of Paulo Freire and bell hooks. And so my work since then for the last 20 years or so as a science educator has been about how can we connect the work of science education with some of these folks who work in these traditions of teaching to change the world, teaching for justice and equity. And so I taught high school chemistry in the Chicago Public Schools for just over 10 years. And now I'm on the faculty here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I live on the south side of Chicago. I have 3 kids, the older 2 of whom go to our neighborhood elementary school.
Thank you. And Sam.
Thank you all for having me. So how I got into science is I come from as far as I know, generations of scientists. My parents were both scientists. My grandmother was a soil scientist in China, which when I was a kid, I thought was the most boring thing possible. But think about it. The soil that's needed to feed all the people in the world, right? And so I always grew up knowing I can be successful in science. I'm a part of science already, sort of. And I'm always conscious that a lot of my students don't have that background, but everybody's got a relationship with science their entire life as they grow up, including. So for my parents, science was a way to change their lives. And that ended up changing my life because they immigrated from China to the United States to do graduate school. And I was born here, and I wouldn't have had the same life anywhere else, especially once I started to transition. I came out as transgender in high school. I definitely wouldn't have had the same life in China or anywhere else, I feel. And so the science has definitely shaped my identity. And then when I was in college, I felt majoring in physiology, surrounded by people that know they're going to become doctors. And I decided to go toward teaching as I thought it would be a quicker way for me to do something that I liked and talk about science every day, but be financially independent sooner. And I guess luckily I ended up really enjoying it. And I've taught high school science in and around Denver, Colorado for the past 6 years. And after a couple of years, I developed enough confidence to start sharing some things that I was doing that were different. Namely, I grew up and had to learn and memorize and do tests about biology in a way that never really acknowledged the difference between gender and sex or gender diversity. And so I started a couple of years ago working with 2 other trans-identified science teachers to create genderinclusivebiology.com, which is a resource website I'll probably talk about later on to help teachers update and make more inclusive their curriculum. And so going on in my 7th year teaching, I hope to continue doing that and teach just as much as I am, I guess, sharing the way that I teach and developing that over time.
Great, thank you, Sam. I think actually since you've, so all of those intros were wonderful. I think that's really great context on your motivations. So Sam, I think actually since you just started to introduce your kind of approach into curriculum, I wonder if you would give your answer to this first question of how you think curriculum shapes equity and justice in K-12 STEM education. And I think it'd be nice to hear both the approaches you've taken, and then if there's anything not what you do, but out there in the world that you want to give as an example, that's also great.
Sure, and thank you, Rebecca, for dropping the link in the chat there. So gender inclusive biology, this started with my need to change this one lesson that I was teaching in the first year that I taught. And it was it was kind of an outdated thing about meiosis, and it's like, well, there's X and Y chromosomes, XX women, XY men. And then here, let's do a little detour where we look at what happens if you get something different. And so why does that happen? Non-disjunction. Something is going wrong in meiosis, and you can get XXY, Klinefelter syndrome, and others. And I just felt that there's a better way to talk about this that is not pathologizing variation. And students deserve to hear that. That would be one instance of intersex traits, chromosomal intersex traits, that most students either don't learn about at all, or they learn about it in that, here's this weird exception kind of way. And we have intersex students, some that are aware of that and share it, or don't share it, or aren't aware of that. And we also have trans students, like I once was, who are sitting there thinking, well, I'm not reflected in this. If XX and XY is what makes you a man or a woman, then I'm not reflected in biology, which is weird because it's supposed to be the study of life. And so the principles of gender inclusive biology are, a lot is revolving around inclusive language. It is more precise, more accurate, really, to say meiosis produces egg cells in people with ovaries, not in women. You have women that don't produce eggs. You have people that aren't women who produce egg cells. That precision is a very small tweak that students will notice. You can have a conversation about it, or you can not, and kind of leave it there as just the precise way that we're talking about things. And in gender inclusive biology, we found that a lot of students appreciate that. They want to learn about the complexity. They want to learn about something that is more complex than a binary. They want to learn about more animal reproductive patterns than what they typically learn. What they usually learn is they often look at birds. Birds, they're monogamous, they mate for life. The males are bigger and flashier. That's one pattern, and that's great. But there are other patterns in animal reproduction that are really exciting, like clownfish that change sex, like species of lizards that reproduce with only females. There's a sea slug whose sex determination is not genetic at all. These are all things that I've exposed students to, and it gives us a richer understanding of whatever the topic may be, like natural selection. And it gives LGBTQ students a chance to say, well, I sort of see myself there in what we're learning, or I see common themes there. And so in the end, we're just pushing the idea that variation is a great thing in science, especially in biology. And it's not necessarily a disease, and it's something that we should learn more about, not in like a sensationalizing way, but normalizing variation in biology. And so if you teach high school or elementary or middle school, you'll find resources on our website, Gender Inclusive Biology. If you teach anything higher than that, including like AP or IB classes or college level classes, I can recommend a great kind of parallel project called Project Biodiversify. And I'll put the link in the chat to their guidance on higher ed, gender inclusive biology teaching.
Thank you, Sam. And I'll make a plug for his website and say that in our graduate genetics classes, I've found things on your site that have actually been really great perspectives and tools. And I think something I'm really excited about this lens you have is that it's not just welcoming students into classes, but also like this type of precision and expansiveness in science is like will make people really different researchers in the future, or health practitioners, or citizens, and all these other things. So thank you for sharing. Perfect, thanks for the link. Rasheda, let's come to you next.
Thank you. How am I following Sam? Oh my goodness, because I'm over here just taking notes, just thinking about the ways that the question is, how does curriculum shape equity and justice? And also for me, I didn't feel as though being represented or seen or included as a Black girl through K-12, through undergrad and master's program, while working in different science labs, while teaching science classes, I didn't see myself. And so, as Sam was saying, in order to change things, we have to expand it. And what I've seen for me and the ways that I approach equity and justice is, because we are expanding, we have to change this thing that we're using. So whatever systems that we're operating in, whatever content materials that we're using, they have to, because we're adding and expanding, they have to transform and shift as well. And so for my dissertation project, that's what I focused on, was trying to center Black girls in science. And I did that through hair care and how do-it-yourself at home, making hair care products is a part of science. Students and people who do create their own products are participating in science practices. And those types of practices, especially the next generation science standards, with those 8 practices that are being shared throughout K-12 for our students, those things can be assessed in a way that is in alignment with whatever the students are already doing. So for me, I wanted to create what I didn't see and celebrate things that were left out, things that were erased because they were so inequitable, and removing. It required assimilation to fit. You learned in science classes, you learn about polar bear fur, you learn about feathers, everyone has hair, and we kind of skip over it and continue on. But I never saw anything in science that talked about my hair in particular, that looked like a picture of me when we got to hair or skin. And so what I felt urgent in my soul to do was create that curriculum. So how does it shift and shape equity and justice? For me, it meant to create something, to bring something into existence that I didn't see, to add one part for Black girls in, it was middle school focused, but Black girls in science spaces, to do something that they are familiar with, what is a part of your home culture, what is a part of your natural doing. And literature says, and even you can talk to anybody, do you do your hair? Mostly yes, somebody's doing their hair. So how do we now incorporate these practices that we do regularly, daily, in community, alone in our kitchens and our bathrooms, as a part of our science learning? And so that also required a lot of undoing, because I, again, was traditionally trained in a lab, and with a master's degree in biology, starting a PhD in education, some things just clashed, because like Daniel was saying earlier, Freire and Bell Hooks are saying, you show up with your full self in this classroom. But all of my experiences in my science classes, the people that were their full selves in the rooms didn't look like me. So do I bring my full self too? And then when I did bring my full self, somebody said, wait, that's a little too much. Could you not? So what does it mean now to create curriculum that not only is representative, but is celebratory, curriculum that is in alignment with the things that people do at home, things that are demystifying science. So it's not at all in any way something that is done in a lab alone that you can't use, but this is something that you might have done already, or something that you saw on YouTube, and how we are all using science practices usually, but naming those things as science practices and naming the people that do them as scientists as well. So for me, curriculum is a part of the process, but also instruction and assessment, support, equity, and advancing justice in science ed for me. So I had to find a way to combine all of those things and really try to, again, expand and make new space for some things that I did not see in my own science learning. Yeah.
Thanks, Rasheda. I think it's really amazing that you have a thread all the way from really personal things about students all the way through to paying attention to national standards and how you do all of that at once. I think actually your after school context is relevant to many people that are joining. Would you mind saying just a little bit about the context of that program to help make it immediate for people?
Okay. I have a lot of experience in after school. So I really enjoy the freedom of 90 minutes of science learning with a variety of age groups. Sometimes you'll have elementary students or middle school, high school, on up, whatever. But the program that I developed was called Lotions and Potions, Science Through Hair Care. And 10 Black girls came into a lab on a college campus, and it was an interdisciplinary lab, so it was not set up at all as a chemistry space or biology space would be. It was think more of your community workspaces with glass walls and different machinery around the room and a couple of floating tables and chairs. And so what we ended up doing was sitting at a table, all of us around the table, sharing materials, talking about our hair, creating models using pipe cleaner. There was an activity where particularly the curriculum that I wrote had to be expanded. And what would it mean to expand in the moment? What does it mean to have multiple right answers in the moment in a science class in a space where there is not one teacher? I sat at the table with the students the entire time for 6 lessons. And it was just one of those experiences where it's like, wow, this is a possibility. This is a way that we can learn science without disconnecting who we are, without having to not see ourselves represented on the page. The girls had coloring pages where they were able to color other Black girls with braided hair, straight hair, whatever, like they saw themselves. And it was some opportunities there where they walked in the room and they looked at the cover of the little pamphlet and it was like, my hair's like this today. And those are the types of things that I never experienced in any science classes, where I could go in, pick up the materials that we were working with and was already connected to it personally. And so through that program, I was able to also assess science and engineering practices like developing models, as well as constructing arguments from evidence. And instead of a summative project being a worksheet or a quiz or like a portfolio, the students created a DIY video where they had to identify a product that they would make, unpack all of the ingredients, and then explain why those ingredients were used. And so through that video, I was able to find claim evidence reason statements verbally. And so now the next step would be to how to support teachers in creating those collaborative moments, supporting conversation in science classrooms, and how do you now assess this? How can this conversation that you're having with your students be a part of your evaluation of their understanding? And so those are broad, big next steps, but it's some things that I'm currently working on.
It's great, thank you. I apologize for the noise. We have some very intense rain in Boston right now. But Daniel, let's go to you next.
Thank you. So when you reached out to me about this event, Dipali, I was really excited to participate because this question doesn't get asked enough. And so I'm really inspired too by Rasheda and Sam's answers, because typically when this issue of equity in STEM education gets addressed, the question's also really limited to whether students get access to rigorous, challenging, or college preparatory science curriculum. And maybe at best, whether that access is different across lines of social marginalization like race, class, gender. But in the issue of access is super important. But we also need to be asking access to what exactly? What are our science classes teaching us? Not only what kind of content and skills are they teaching us, but what kinds of ideologies are they teaching us? And so what Sam and Rasheda are talking about is not only inclusion of Black students or LGBTQIA+ students, but also what kinds of ideologies students are learning and internalizing about racism, about sexism, about justice, about inclusion, about gender, right? Like our science classes are part of how students learn their politics and learn their ideologies and how they see the world. And so, as you mentioned, Dipali, not only will this curriculum make much different researchers, the type of curriculum that Sam and Rasheda are talking about, but also much different community members, much different participants in our society, whether or not they go on to study science further. And so, you know, when I think about this question, I think about how in English class, you know, educators have long been critiquing what they call the canon, right? Everybody has to read Shakespeare and Mark Twain and Hemingway, and it's really easy to see how the canon is full of white men with similar perspectives. but we don't like to admit as readily that there's a canon in science class. Newton's laws, Darwin's theory of evolution, Avogadro's number. Are those really the most fundamental or important concepts for our students to learn? And is it actually important for them to know who they're named after? If you take my earlier example, knowing about dioxins and the health ramifications of the medical waste incinerators would have been way more important to me than knowing Boyle's law or Charles' law. But in science, we assume there's some kind of fundamental order or sequence to understanding principles or concepts, and that's really just not the case. And I think as we hear in Rasheda and Sam's examples, people learn what matters to them. And so, you know, when I think about my field as chemistry, to be honest, the field of chemistry has always kind of treated Earth as a repository for human consumption. And it's treated synthetic chemicals and the way that people manipulate chemicals as beneficial, with maybe a few unfortunate side impacts, right? You have old school chemistry sayings like the solution to pollution is dilution, or you have the field of chemistry placing the burden of communities that have been harmed by toxic chemicals on those communities to prove that something went wrong, instead of on the scientists who produced those chemicals in mass amounts, right? And so when we teach the canon of science, we're reinforcing that the ideologies that underlie some of those issues. And that's not what I want to do with my chemistry classes. And of course, there are examples that we can see in the other disciplines, both in Sam and Rasheda's responses, but you know, there's lots of examples we could bring up. If we have time, we could talk about more of them. So I guess for me, equitable and just science curriculum begins from what I call social justice science issues. And to make another connection to Paulo Freire, they're what Freire called generative themes. Some people call them socio-scientific issues, but they're more than that too, because they have to matter in the context where you're teaching to your students, to their families, to their community members, and they have to take into account the larger socio-political context, issues like environmental racism, housing discrimination. And so once we've identified some social justice science issues, then we can ask, what is the science that's relevant to learn? Instead of starting from what is the science students need to learn, and then how we can make connections. I think it's not always easy, but it's better to start from what are the issues that may matter, and what do we have evidence matters to students and their communities, and then what's the relevant science. And it requires a lot of work on the part of the teacher and a lot of collaboration with colleagues, with community organizations, with parents, with students. And it requires teachers to learn a lot too, because we didn't get educated, and I heard both Sam and Rasheda say this too, we're not teaching science the way we learned it. And so what they didn't mention, but I'm sure it's true, is it takes a ton of relearning and work. And maybe they didn't even mention that. A lot of relearning the science that we supposedly have degrees in to teach like this. But I think that's the direction we need to move. That's the type of learning that universities and schools need to start supporting.
Thanks, Daniel. Daniel, can I ask you to add just a little bit more? Actually, I know that the work you've done in Chicago you really had this ecosystem of students and teachers and environmental organizations and the university. Can you talk a little bit just about that partnership? Because I think that's another thing that's aspirational maybe for people on the call.
For sure. I was going to mention that to another question, but I'll say a little bit about it here and try not to be repetitive. I mean, it's been really important. When I started teaching at a high school here in Chicago that was founded by a community hunger strike against educational inequity, the charge from the school community was really, make the principles of the struggle that founded the school come alive in the curriculum. And so my colleagues and I reached out to a local organization that was focused on fighting environmental racism in the neighborhood. And we tried to learn from them what issues they were organizing around. And then we developed our curriculum from those issues. And that, partnership has been ongoing now for about 15 years between the teachers who are still at that school. And then through our collaborations, we've gotten in touch with scientists who care about issues of environmental justice. And, I'll say more later about those connections, but they've been really humble and helpful in lending their expertise. And so there is kind of these connections between organizers and scientists and students and teachers, where we try to kind of take up each other's priorities and each other's problems and try to make the learning reciprocal in that way.
That's great, thank you. Any last thoughts from the three of you before we go to our next question? Okay, so next is, with such a big or growing focus on diversity and equity in STEM, you each share thoughts you have about how we can make a shift towards inclusivity in our STEM spaces. So for example, in the labs or internships or part-time jobs or other places that are often students' kind of first STEM experience after their college. And if you have thoughts also about things still while they're in school, that's also great here. So Daniel, let's start with you.
So I guess I want to start with, let's not focus on including folks in science as it is, right? Let's change science and let's talk about how we might use science to change the world, right? So I think forever, science teachers, as long as science has been a subject in school, science teachers have been positioned as promoters of the scientific enterprise. And there are things that I love about science, but the scientific enterprise is a big, huge thing with lots of really powerful institutions and people, and I'm not a promoter of a lot of it, right? Like DuPont Chemical Corporation, I don't promote them. The military industrial complex, I'm not interested in promoting that. And so I think instead of just saying, hey kids, look at how awesome this science stuff is, we have to consider how, as Rasheda said earlier, we can make space for students' full authentic selves in whatever programming or education we're doing, and then also how we can learn from them and work with them to change the culture of science, to change the goals of STEM education, right? We have to think about what kinds of STEM opportunities we're promoting. If my students go into STEM and work on developing the next weapon of mass destruction that kills marginalized people somewhere else in the world, or they synthesize a chemical that disproportionately pollutes Black communities here in Chicago, was that an equitable educational experience they received? I would argue no, even if they are individually very successful at whatever they're doing, right? You know, what if they're a geologist and they end up playing a small role in building the next oil pipeline through an indigenous community, even though the community's been, you know, raising objections about that process? And so that's not the kind of STEM pathways we want to create. And so, because I think when we say STEM, we have these ideas that everybody's a doctor at a community health center or engineering solar panels for a nonprofit's new building. But the reality is that a lot of STEM opportunities are related to the military industrial complex or to corporations that are exploiting the earth and their workers, or who don't have our community's best interests in mind, right? And so we have to push beyond just making the STEM workforce more diverse and make sure that also that our STEM work is not exploitative, not extractive, not violent, not unsustainable, especially for the communities where those diverse workers are coming from. Right. And so that's part of it for me, is like, how are we talking about the STEM enterprise, and how are we connecting students with educational experiences and pathways that are equitable truly in terms of their end goals and not just in terms of the day-to-day.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate you adding this. And I'll just add on, maybe for everybody, that, you know, there's parts of STEM that I think, you know, many people recognize as causing harm. And then there's other parts of STEM that I think on the surface or the face of it is that it's a positive equity promoting, you know, things in biomedical research, for example, that actually when you dig in, there's really, really unjust things in the structures or harm that's committed. So I think, I don't know, I felt like that when I was in infectious disease research, and I think it's a thing that all of us have to pay really close attention at what's happening in our places we're working. Great. So thanks, Daniel. And Sam, we'll go to you next for this one.
I very much agree there. Students or young people are never, they're never taught while they're young, to question science. That's not in the canon. Doing science is just framed as good. You're doing science, and in K through 12, we can accustom our students to questioning the status quo and expose them to truths. These aren't in the canon, though maybe they're becoming in the canon, like the story of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and to help students get in that habit of questioning current science practices and science enterprises. When I talk to a lot of my students who are LGBTQ, they, I think in general, the assumption is, well, for trans people, medicine helps you, hormone therapy, developing techniques for surgeries. And I'll say, do you know every time there's a major war, they develop better gender confirmation surgery, lower surgery, because it's the people coming back from the war that are the main beneficiaries of that breakthrough, right? And we need to live with the fact that we're kind of benefiting on the side from that, and be aware of that. When I think about spaces that are young people's first exposure to science, shifting gears, there are a lot of cues that you get entering these kinds of spaces that tell you, well, what kind of place is this? If you mainly, let's say you, in high school, your favorite classes, favorite teachers, or friend groups, they were welcoming and generally shared their pronouns when meeting new people or in a new setting. And then you enter like an internship and that doesn't happen, that you immediately start kind of titrating yourself, deciding how much of yourself you're going to bring into that space. And so that first exposure, I think ideally, young science learner is going to meet new people and learn that scientists are full people and be able to share how they want to be known in that space as they come into it.
Thanks so much, Sam. Rasheda, let's go to you.
Yeah, I want to first thank you both for sharing what you've shared, because you took my part. And by you took my part, both of you really added to questioning. Just ask the question, why is it this way? And for me, what I have had to, I guess, reckon with is that I do not want to be a part of the more underrepresented minority students in STEM. Why? I was traumatized. I was asked, required, expected to strip off all of the things that made me me to fit into this science lab, the science team, this to fit the face of representing my department, representing my lab, whatever, when it wasn't a true representation of me. There have been many opportunities and experiences of harm and trauma in science spaces because I was the only blank, Black person, Black woman, tall person, curly, the only one this conversation, this bit of trauma is associated with. And I personally don't want to participate in continuing putting that on other students. So for me, it's how do we literally change the space, right? Why do we have to have this sterile work environment if you are going to work in a science lab? And by sterile, all the walls are white. There are no pictures up. It's only science around the room. It's very quiet. You work in your own space and you don't socialize in this way. What would happen if we just question why? Who said? And what would it mean to change and center and celebrate, affirm, empower somebody else, something else other than, well, that's the way they've always done it. So it's like, so for me, both of you mentioned questioning, both of you mentioned different ways to resist. And I would rather seek spaces of freedom, spaces of care for my students. And I don't always think that sending them into STEM labs or spaces for internships or co-ops is the most caring thing to do sometimes. So for me, I think that finding ways that we can push against the lack of representation, push against this tokenization, push against isolation, erasure, marginalization of students in STEM spaces. Like, we want to talk diversity all day, but what happens when they get there, right? Like, why would I just take you and, you know, see all the great things in you and then put you into a space of harm? So how can we shift these STEM spaces to be more caring, more inclusive, more welcoming? Like Sam was saying, how do we make that part of the norm on the STEM side before we decide to, let's diversify it, but is it a safe space? And I think Daniel really highlighted the ways that we can just ask questions. We can push back and say, I don't think so. Or if you don't see it, how can we make something that is better, that is caring, and that is humanizing in a way that STEM spaces are not currently?
Thanks, Rasheda. Yeah, I can really hear from all of you that something shared is that you've created, you know, you're not bringing science into what you experienced as science maybe, but that there's a lot of intention that goes into the environment and the content of creating a space that's science, but is tailored to the students and what you want them to experience. And it's cool to hear very different versions of that between all of you. Any last thoughts on this before we go to our next question? I'm also going to, yeah, Rasheda.
I have a question for Daniel and Sam. What oppositions have you both run into as you are literally pushing against the system, the bigger parts? What has been uncomfortable or uneasy, difficult in the ways that you are trying to just tell the truth and support your students?
I can go ahead. One thing that's been difficult is I've really felt like this summer, at this point in this year, the state of the Gender Inclusive Biology Project is really that we have teachers who are very into it, and we have this lagging edge of educators who don't have the knowledge, confidence to implement any of this. And I think we've been very successful at reaching the teachers who have more knowledge and confidence, folks that would seek out professional development in this way. And you know, I don't know what's the way forward. I've spoken to folks that work in the legislature that think, well, a bill that would make some more things mandatory is not the way forward right now, because of how, I guess, how vigilant opposition is, right? Response to a critical race theory, responses to progressive sex education and curriculum in all subjects has been seemingly at its peak. And so what I've been thinking about a lot lately is how do we continue to do this work and well, broaden who is benefiting from it, knowing that there are I guess phases of acceptance. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of pushback from, I think, small parts of the education community, but that doesn't change the fact that sex is not a binary in any species. That doesn't change the evidence, the truth in science, right? And so my feeling of urgency is pushing up against that.
I think, first of all, thank you for asking that question, Rasheda. And I think to build on Sam's point, the notion that science education isn't political sometimes is sort of a way, an escape route for people who don't want to deal with these things. I was hired once when I was still a high school teacher to work on developing a set of side materials for a nationally published curriculum to make things more relevant here in Chicago. And I wrote a piece about the environmental racism of coal power plants. And they didn't like that piece. The publishers of the curriculum didn't end up liking a lot of my pieces because they said they were too political. And so I pushed back, and eventually they admitted, like, no, it's because we'd like for this curriculum to get adopted in Texas, and Big Oil has, you know, big interests in Texas, and through their state curriculum process, we're worried about that. And so it becomes clear then it's not that it's too political, it's that it goes against the interest of the dominant politics, which is, I think, what Sam is speaking to also, right? And so, because it's always political. And so then, you know, when we think about it that way, another issue that ends up being a lot less active resistance, but more passive resistance, is that if we have a different set of priorities for science education, then we end up asking a lot of teachers, a lot of learning, a lot of curriculum development work, a lot of, because the materials don't exist, and, you know, it's not how they learned science, and it's not teaching towards the test. And so it ends up being taking a lot of time that people don't have extra time in their lives. And so it becomes a sort of more passive barrier. But I'm curious to hear your response to your own question, Rasheda.
What resistance have I been met with? Well, after making the Lotions and Potions Science Through Hair Care curriculum, a lot of the questions were, well, what about people who aren't Black girls? Well, we talk about curls, we talk about skin, and we talk about hair. You're included. Like, just because it starts with creating your own hair products, or it's centered around making your own things, this is still general information that we already learn in science spaces, just centering somebody else. And it's okay. I promise you, you will be fine, because for all this time, we have learned about everybody else. We've seen everybody else. So what would happen if now we just shift the people that we see, and it's like, oh no. So most of it is just being okay with not seeing yourself centered in something. For me, again, being a teacher educator, I am talking to my undergraduate students who are just starting their clinical teaching days, and they are spending more time in front of students, and they want to always say that, you know, I already learned culturally relevant pedagogy. I know that from a different class. I got it down. Teach me how to teach science. I'm like, these are not separate things in any way. So a lot of my resistance in that way is really saying, if you are going to at least use culturally relevant pedagogy, use the 3 things that it says you're going to use. Like, it's not just, you know, putting up pictures of Black and brown people, or changing a name to fit your student's name, or a name that they decided that the class came up with. It's really shifting the focus of your curriculum, shifting the way that you assess your students, shifting the ways that you talk to your students, and how you show up in your classroom. Those things make it culturally relevant. You can, you know, stick a picture of a Black person on it, but that does not change the things that you are saying to your students, the ways that you are assessing your students, and the curriculum you're putting in front of them. So until those things shift, we're kind of continuing in the same way, but just now saying that we're using the buzzword. So my resistance has been student resistance, which I'm always have to be careful about, because they are also evaluating me at the end of the semester. But I can't in any way be comfortable that I did a good job preparing these educators if I don't tell them the truth, right? If you are not showing up in your classroom with full care for your students, even the little ones, because these are elementary teachers, or soon to be elementary teachers, your kindergartners come in with plenty of information. They come in ready to learn, ready to share, and you need to respect that and affirm that and empower that, make space for that in your classroom, so that you all can learn together. And that is not the way at all any of us were taught science, any of us participated in science. And so the resistance for me has been just really trying to help shift these future educators' perspectives on what is just good teaching. What does it mean to show up and center your students' interests, and how does that make you now feel completely vulnerable and taking risks that you didn't sign up to take? But it's a way that we can really connect with our students. And like you said, Daniel, these things don't exist yet, and it's a big burden on the teacher. So how do, you know, us in other ways create supports for these teachers in these spaces to do some really transformative work for themselves and for their students.
Great, Rasheda, I'm really glad you asked this question and that we got to hear answers from all of you. So before we go to our next question, I'm just going to remind the audience that if you would like to ask a question, which will be our next section, you can go ahead and put them into the Q&A. So feel free to start putting questions in if you want, and we'll be getting there in 5 or 10 minutes. So our last planned question is how people who have STEM backgrounds and are maybe currently practicing in a STEM field get involved in K-12 education. And Sam, we'll start with you. And I think, you've mentioned things from the classroom through legislative level. So anywhere in that spectrum, what are ways you think people can advocate or get involved?
For folks with STEM backgrounds, I would ask, what are your connections in the community to K-12 education, the school that your children attend, your neighborhood school, your neighborhood institutions, and know that if you haven't been a K-12 teacher, K-12 teachers really like to hear from adults who are not teachers to collaborate in any way. So I think ways that you can be involved, let's start with being a thought partner with your local teachers, being a guest. My students really enjoy any opportunity to interview a scientist, whether that's digitally or in person. And with that, they're also getting an idea of that scientists are entire people, and they're not just churning out data, and they're not just locked away in a room, not allowed to talk to non-scientists. In terms of legislative pathways, here in Colorado, there's, in every state, there is revision of the state curriculum every 5 years or so. And most US states have, as Rasheda was mentioning earlier, something based on the next generation science standards that really allows a lot of room for science practices. That's what students need to be doing. And so the idea being that everything that students do in class should be things that scientists do outside of education. And so one thing that's been on my mind lately is, well, specifically, I feel that there needs to be a standard of care in regard to the way that biology is taught. We're teaching about life and about humans, about living things, and there needs to be standards more detailed than what's in the NGSS about how we include all of our students. And I know that that's not only being gender inclusive, but that's a part that I've been a big voice in the conversation about. And we are, we're going to have support from, say, LGBTQ advocate organizations, but at this point, I don't know how much support we would have from, say, local science organizations to say, yeah, this is important. As scientists, please improve the way that you're teaching our future scientists. And so that's an area that I think folks with STEM backgrounds who aren't yet involved in K-12 education can be involved as advocates.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sam. Before we go to you, Rasheda and Daniel, I'm just going to add to my question. So I asked you about ways people could be involved. If you have thoughts on ways people shouldn't be involved or, harmful practices that you've seen, tell us about those too. So that's my order. Rasheda, let's go to you next.
Yeah, so when I was first thinking about this question, I went straight to, well, some people just don't need to do it. Because, and I've had these experiences as well, wanting to invite someone in to share about their experiences or suggestions for students to go toward these career paths. And it's, again, more introduction or requirement for trauma and harm. Just because you did it does not mean we all have to continue to do it. I've had experiences where I have not been welcomed into a lab space. Someone was coming out of the door that was authorized personnel only, and he slid out of the door and said, you have to have access to this area. And I was like, well, here's my key in my hand. What about me says that I don't belong in this area? And I was in a master's program at the time. And so it's, even if that person who could have been very well involved in the community, why would now he continue these ideas that some people are welcome and some people are not? And what does that mean in the ways that he may or may not intentionally speak to students about options and career paths? Would it be if I go into a room of predominant female students, we'll just remove some science options because I don't think that they are capable of doing it? Or if I go into a room where I know I've heard that this school does not do well on their reading scores, some of my discussion might change and I might deter students from going into STEM careers or pathways or fields because these biases do exist. So how, for me, it's more of, who is this person? What are they offering? Because everyone should not be given access to sending students into STEM careers or pathways, but it's more of, how do you care about students? How do you care about children? Do you even like children? If you don't, why are you talking to them? Like, just, I'm not inviting you to come to my class to say this thing of, well, you have to, get hundreds on your science test. You have to make straight A's. You should go into these fields because they're more lucrative, but how are you caring about students? How do you share your care about students? How does that come out in the ways that you speak about education or the ways that you speak about your own career journey? Things that you're interested in changing, because for me, as I was engaging with students while I was still a testing scientist, it was not enough for me to just acknowledge their concerns about STEM careers and paths. For me, I had to say, wait, I gotta change it. And I'm referring to the story where there were 3 7th grade girls who laughed in my face when I told them I was a scientist. And they said, you can't be a scientist because scientists are old white men. And for me, that it was not enough to say, well, I'm obviously a scientist and just like move on. It was, I have to do something to change this idea that all scientists are white men. I'm standing right here in front of you and I was completely erased. So what did it mean now for me to literally shift everything to say, these are the ways that you, little Black girl, are represented in science? And I think that we have to be careful of how we connect folks who might already be, well established in their fields, in order to try to change what we know as science and what the fields are, what those spaces are, and how can they become healing spaces and less spaces of isolation, less spaces of erasure or oppression, but how can they really be spaces of liberation, spaces of discovery and transformation? And I believe that science is a great space for that, but it really requires us to tear down and unravel some of the, or all of the things, honestly, that we have continued, things that have been perpetuated, things that have been just common, and really question those and take those apart. And I feel as though some people that are in these fields and in these spaces are interested in doing that. And I'm really excited to bring those people in to engage with students versus those that want to kind of, well, if I had to go through these things, you need to go through these things. So I think it's really, it has to be intentional, the people that we seek to engage with our kids.
Thank you, Rasheda. Daniel.
Before I start, I'll just mention that there's a couple good questions in the Q&A box, and I typed a response at first not realizing that I would move them to the answered column. I don't intend to, like, that's Zoom's problem. I didn't mean to dismiss them or to exclude others from answering them also. So I'll answer the addition to your question, probably really quickly, which is like, one thing that I've found since I've been at a university is colleagues from the STEM departments who reach out to me just because they know they need a community engagement or outreach part of their NSF proposal. And so they wanted like a quick way to add it in so that they can get back to their real work of doing the science. I can't imagine that anybody who shows up to an event like this would ever do anything like that. But that's the wrong way to go about it for sure. It's very superficial and it's very much just about seeking the funding more than it is about genuine engagement in those cases. I'll give you an example that's kind of the exact opposite of that. I'm lucky enough, as I mentioned earlier, to work with 3 really amazing scientists, and I'll give them a shout out. Catherine Nagy is a geochemist, and she's head of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at my institution at UIC. Shelby Hatch is a chemist at Northwestern University, and Alana Fitch is a chemist who just retired from Loyola University Chicago. And so my first collaboration with Alana actually stretches all the way back to 2004. I can't believe 17 years ago when I was a really young high school teacher. But so for the last 5 years, those 3 scientists have been working with me and a group of about 7 Chicago public school chemistry teachers, a group of environmental justice organizers, and some young people on what we call youth participatory science projects. And so youth participatory science is somewhere between youth participatory action research and citizen science. And specifically, our projects are focused on urban heavy metal contamination, lead, mercury, but also maybe manganese and other metals. And we've also been working on some air particulate matter pollution recently. And so one of the coolest and most transformative and helpful things that the scientists have done in those projects is offer their scientific expertise and their instruments so that we have access to lab spaces and instruments that we could never afford or have the expertise to operate in high school science labs. And so students have collected soil samples and water samples and brought them to the labs. And in some cases, they get to actually do the workup of the samples. When other cases, they pass them off to the scientists or to the graduate students. Who then can test them for concentrations of lead or mercury and then send the raw data back to the students and teachers who then get to make sense of the data and figure out how to share results with their community and decide whether any further action is required. But it goes way beyond that. These 3 scientists are not just like experts in the sense of them testing our environmental samples, but they've also been working with us in our planning institutes that we have every year, where they're deeply involved with teachers and young people and organizers. We're all working on curriculum together, right? And so they've really been interacting with all of us at those sessions. And, these are brilliant women, super accomplished and impressive chemists who are so humble and so willing to work with, learn from, and learn with the teachers, the students, the community organizers. And I think that's what really makes our collaborations work, is that everybody is considered an expert in their own right. And to be able to work with 3 accomplished scientists who take that stance and are really curious to learn from the high school students when they're there, really respect the wisdom of the community organizers who are there, really value the skills of the teachers in developing curriculum. One of Kathy Nagy, who works here at UIC, actually took one of the activities that we developed in our planning institutes and brought it to one of her college classes, right? So there's really like a reciprocal learning and exchange that happens in those spaces. And I think I feel super fortunate to work with folks who have that attitude.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, which is less time than I wish we had. But I'll maybe ask you, so Rasheda, Daniel, and Sam, you can all see the questions in the Q&A, and I think some of you have started typing answers, but if there's anything you want to add on to one of the questions, go ahead and just maybe read a bit of the question and then share whatever you'd like to. And I'll note there's one question from Diego in the chat that we haven't talked about yet. Just jump in.
I was still typing my answer, sorry.
No, you're good.
So hi, Diego, thank you for your question. I approach this in a way where I can't avoid it, because conveniently I'm a Black woman. And I show up with these identities that exist in a structure, in a system, in a space where all of these things are not equal across the board. So my students come into a room and I say, well, hi, this is who I am. This is what I bring. These are the ways that we will experience science together. And it has to be present for me. I don't get the leisure of leaving it out. So I have to talk about the ways that Black girls can feel isolated in science spaces and in science learning. I have to talk about the ways that burnout happens when you have one faculty member who has to now mentor with this extra labor that is not a part of their regular, their other peers' teaching responsibilities, but they do care and they want other students to succeed. And so now you have these mentor connections that are being made, but they're not always expressed, or they're not always honored or rewarded in other ways. And so, oh, I see that to read Diego's question. It says, CRT is under attack and anything with social justice and equity connotations could backfire. How does that change the way science educators committed to equity and social justice should approach their work? And what I'm saying is, because I am present, I am here, I have to say, and these are the ways that purposefully, because of the way it was set up, I was left out in this way, or someone next to you in the room would have been left out in this way. Like, because we are present, that is also a part of the resistance itself. So how do we now bring that into the room and critically discuss, what does this mean? And that might mean we say critical race theory. Oh no. But also we will be fine, I promise you. It's a shift in power that is the scary part, but it makes everybody better. So I'm trying to work with my students in embracing these ideologies, these different frameworks that center somebody else, care for other people in different ways. You go to the margins to see how to help, how to support versus the majority voice. And what does that mean now? Not necessarily to require tiptoeing, but to say, well, here is the truth. This is what we are dealing with. How can we now support our students? And when I say our students, not just me as a teacher, educator, but those folks as future teachers. How do you support your students and say, well, you might not have been represented in this way. What does that mean? Because students can see it, students can feel it. And now you are the teacher leading. How can you, again, show up and be your whole self and welcome your students to bring their whole selves as well. Sorry.
Thanks, Rasheda. And just so everyone knows, we'll have a YouTube recording of this up later, and we'll include the answers to the questions that have been asked, so you have it. So I'm going to take us 3 minutes over time and ask each of you on the panel, just if you want to close for a minute, either something you didn't get to say today that you wish you had gotten to, or kind of any last things you feel like are things just that this audience of scientists and engineers should know about K-12 education. So Sam, let's start with you. You're muted still.
You got it. So things that folks should know about K-12 education. Well, this is kind of an obvious statement, but education is the way that social values are passed down. And so what we teach about in science class and the way that goes down, that directly impacts the future of science and as such the rest of society. So I guess I'm saying that to highlight the importance of the work and to encourage folks, knowing that we're in a climate of a lot of pushback in a lot of cases, to stay strong and to keep doing the work. the pushback means that visibility is increasing, and it happens all the time. But like Rasheda was saying, we don't have other options. So I want to encourage everyone who's attending to, as a STEM person who's practicing science or engineering, to continue to stay involved with the K-12 education locally and beyond. And thank you for learning with us.
Sam. Daniel.
So I guess hopefully this isn't repetitive, but I think that there's no such thing as a good or a neutral or objective education. Education always has a point of view. It's always political. And most STEM educators have kind of avoided these really rich traditions of transformative education that are, connected with social movements that change the world for the better. So one way that I like to think about it is based on a feminist philosopher of science named Sandra Harding. She wrote this book way back in '86. And the title of the book is The Feminist Question in Science. And so her starting point is that there's these three really important lines of inquiry into science, right? The first were equity studies that examined inequities experienced by women scientists. The second were studies that examined examples of science being used to perpetuate sexist, racist, or imperialist ideologies. And the third exposed the way sexist forces shape the formulation of scientific problems. And so Harding summarized those three types of studies as asking some version of how can women be more equitably treated in science, or what she calls the women question in science. She said that instead she wanted to ask the science question in feminism, right, which is the title of the book. And the science question in feminism is how can we sort of co-opt or repurpose and reimagine science so that it's useful in the struggle for women's liberation from patriarchy, right? And so I want us to ask, that's how I think of science education. I want us to ask the science question in social justice education, right? How can the teaching and learning of science be useful to the efforts people are engaged in to make our society anti-racist, not beholden to all the forms of oppression that it is right now? Where is science education useful in that? Let's ask ourselves that question.
Thanks, Daniel. I have a new book to read now. Rasheda.
Sam just added it. And to add to what both of you have already said, it's, for me, if you don't see it, you got to make it. And that is a heavy lift to ask of anyone working in K-12, because what? At what time do you get to just go make a new curriculum, make a new assessment? Like when does that happen? When do you have that space to literally create these things? And I was reading the question from Brandy, like what to do and how to do it. And it literally will be putting something together that does not exist, and it celebrates your students. And it's going to be one of the most beautiful things and the hardest labor of love, but also it's something that students will remember. Students will be able to bring with them outside of their classroom these ways of transferring knowledge that is not always celebrated or is not always identified, particularly in science and engineering spaces. I have, I guess, been privileged of coming out of a lab and into a classroom, and I can actually tell my current teacher, pre-service teachers, that we don't need to memorize all of these things. I worked in the lab that long, and I needed to know nothing. I needed to know processes. I needed to know concepts. I needed to know large patterns. I did not need to know that one word. I didn't even know how to spell it. I didn't need to know the definition of it. I needed to understand what was going on. So how do we center and focus on the activities, the practices, the understandings, the concepts, the larger ideas versus, paper tests, versus spelling something right, versus using this one word? How do we really connect with what is happening? What are these processes? How are you already doing some of these practices? And how can we now make the content very relevant, very personal, very useful to you. And I think that's something that all of us are continuing in different ways and also in the same way. And I'm really encouraged to hear from you both and these questions. So I'm very grateful to be here. I have a million thoughts, probably gonna go write something because just this dream space is inspiring. So a lot of times in education, it feels very doomsday and it's all done and over and it's terrible, but also these are opportunities to create something that is liberatory, create something that is caring, that centers your students, that allows for yourself to be present for you as a teacher and your students in the room, and also connecting with that content in a way that is not further traumatizing. So I think that is definitely what I wish scientists, engineers knew about K-12. I want so many opportunities for students, young students, to be named as scientists and engineers in the ways that they already tinker, in the ways that they already solve problems, in the ways that they already go through a full process of testing and sharing out information. I want those everyday activities of getting on, Xbox, getting on the PlayStation and sharing new information. How are those things connected to science practices? That is my overall life goal, is to really shift what is understood as our normal and accepted science content to what are we doing every day at home? How are we already being scientists and engineers? So again, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to have learned from you two and all of us in the chat as well.
Thanks, Rasheda. Well, thank you all, panelists. Thank you everyone in the audience for your great questions and ideas. And I'm noticing that the panelists sent a couple answers in the chat that maybe didn't go to all the attendees. So we're gonna pull all this good information out and we'll get it to you along with the Google Doc of resources afterwards. So now the last thing is just to say thank you to everybody. It's taken away my Zoom clapping hands, but I will do this. And we're looking forward to staying in touch with all of you. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm tuning in on my phone now as my internet cut out, but this was amazing, really wonderful.